Today we're reviewing Motion Ride's E18 Plus fork. I've now had a month on this fork and I've got a pretty good feel for how it rides, and today I'm going to do my best to put that into words. If you haven't already seen it, go check out the first look where I answer a lot of the questions about this fork. Right now we're running a 2.6 tire and there is barely clearance in there, 29 by 26, but it's fitting, but just barely. The whole premise behind this fork is it's different. And so it's not gonna ride the same as a telescoping fork, it's not gonna look the same, and it's not gonna behave the same. So today I'm gonna do my best to put into words how this rides different, because it really does ride different than a telescoping fork. All right, let's hit the trail. All right, so right off the bat, when you ride one of these, you will notice it looks so different. Looking down, all the linkage is behind you, and it looks very different. And when you squish it, it looks very different. You don't realize how used to telescoping forks you are till you ride something different. This bike kind of feels like having a full suspension linkage on the front of your bike. There's no other way to describe it. There's no stiction and bushings or seals. It's just real smooth in that first 25% of the travel. It's more supple than a coil fork even. Just that initial 25, maybe 30% of travel is just so much traction, so smooth. But then the rest of its travel feels really different. It's also really odd looking down and not knowing how far you are in your travel at any given point you're riding. That sounds dumb, but you'd be surprised how much you look at your fork legs on a telescoping fork to kind of get a gauge of how much the fork's moving. And that's really hard to tell when you're on the bike riding this. But that initial stroke is unlike anything else. I think riders who don't throw their body weight around a lot and just kind of stay glued to the ground and pedal are gonna love this thing. Yeah, really smooth, really in control. It feels like a linkage, like the wheel moves back and out of the way. I'm not sure what the actual motion path is, but it sure feels like it takes the bumps in stride. This fork has a lot of movement in it, and you feel that. Saps your energy when you're spinning away. It does have a firm mode on the compression setting that you can flip down and switch. But a lot of us ride a lot of up and down, and we don't want to be flipping switches all the time. And because of the location of that, you can't just reach down and do it while you're riding. Because it feels like a linkage, with the axle path and how it reacts to bumps, you can keep your speed a lot better than with the telescoping fork. I just feel like the fork gets out of the way more. It doesn't get hung up and lets your momentum carry forward instead of getting hung up on bumps. So when you hit chattery stuff, instead of the bike stalling and stuttering, it wants to move through it faster. Kind of like the difference between a hardtail and a good full suspension. I feel like the tire tracks a little bit better. Even though it bobs under pedaling, it still feels supportive. So I don't feel the front end diving at all, which is really nice. This is a 140 fork right now. And at no point in the month of my testing have I felt like the fork is diving or changing the head angle too much. It obviously does change, but I'm not blowing through travel and I don't feel that abrupt change that I feel on a lot of telescoping forks. Right now on this climb, you can feel the weight and you can definitely feel the bobbing. That bobbing's a major disadvantage on sprinty climbs. Here on this flatter, mellow stuff, when you're seated and spinning, it doesn't feel tons different. It's supple and it tracks the ground well. Really good small bump sensitivity without feeling mushy, which I like. But you do feel it moving when you pedal. That's so odd. Kind of like when you pedal an old FSR bike with the shock all the way open. Super gooey traction where it's just glued to the ground, but bobs like crazy. You do feel it, which is an interesting sensation on a hardtail that's normally pretty sprinty and quick. And you feel the weight of the fork. It is not light. This thing's heavier than a Fox 36. One of the main design ideas behind this fork was getting it to not dive on brake input. If you've ridden a full suspension with a soft fork or a fast rebound in the back and you hit the brakes, you can feel it unload and shift all the way to the front. And Motion Ride wanted to avoid that with the design of this fork. And I can say that it does do that, but I think that's what's causing some of the bob when you're putting down power. On hardtails, we don't often feel the front dive because there's no rear suspension to deal with, so it's minimal, but you do feel the difference. Let's take this on some rowdier terrain now. Yeah, feels good up that. It really is a smooth fork. Taking down some spicier terrain. It firms up a little under braking. Not quite as plush through there as a normal fork. Let's take it in a little faster setting. I know that's what a lot of you like to see. So I feel like it stiffens up halfway through its travel and stays real supportive, almost to the point where it feels like it has less travel than it does. I also feel like when you're hitting rocks like stair steps, it doesn't compress much. It stays high in its travel and it's in control, and the front wheel kind of gets out of the way. You don't feel the front end dive quite so much. It also stiffens up though, so you get a little bit less travel than you would with a telescoping fork. Like, it's fast through all this stuff, but the wheel's not quite as planted as with a telescoping fork. Yeah, it's getting firm. It's fun, like, it just feels like a 120 fork though. It's a double-edged sword. The front end doesn't dive, but it also doesn't quite track like the telescoping fork. So I find myself with a lot of control, but it is bumpy. All right. Even here on the road where I'm pedaling smooth circles, you can see the bob. It does have that lockout feature, but you have to get off the bike to change it. So Motion Ride has done something very different from a telescoping fork. There are so many things that I like. I like that it uses a carbon leaf spring instead of an air spring to change the pressure per se, or the spring rate. I just stick an Allen in there and adjust it there to put more or less preload on the leaf spring. I love that. I love that soft, supple initial feel. It feels like a linkage instead of, you know, bushing sliding past the stanchion. It's got such nice sensitivity on the small stuff. It erases everything smaller than a golf ball on the trail. Feels so good. I like that they think outside the box. I know a lot of you are never gonna ride one of these because you think they're ugly. I don't buy bikes for what they look like. Obviously, I spray painted mine. I just like to have fun on bikes. And if this does something better than a telescoping fork, I don't care what it looks like because it makes the ride better and more fun. So that's the camp that I'm in. The question is, does it do everything better than a telescoping fork? No, not everything, but some things, yes. That initial sensitivity is incredible. The way it tracks the ground at small movements is incredible. The way it resists braking forces is good. It feels like a very damped fork when you're hitting chunky stuff at speed. And I don't feel it moving as much and tracking the ground so much. It just wants to kind of, it doesn't skip, but it stays on top of the terrain instead of following every undulation in it. And so it's a bumpier, a little bit harsher ride, kind of like the Trust fork, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But it doesn't dive and it's still supportive and there's still traction. So it still moves out of the way. It just doesn't, it's not as smooth. So it's bumpier at the handlebars, but faster because it's not moving as much, not getting hung up quite as much. If you've ridden a Trust fork, they've got the same feel. They're not supple, they're not smooth, they're not soft, they're a little bit jarring, but man, you can charge so fast on them, which seems like an oxymoron. If it's jarring and bumpy and you're having a hard time like hanging on, how could you be faster? I feel like it's just the axle path or the way that it kind of absorbs and kind of almost has, I don't know if this has a rearward axle path or not, but it feels like it tucks up out of the way instead of just slides up some stanchions. So it's hard to say if it's actually faster or if it just feels faster. It's amazing the amount of control you have despite it being bumpy. Some things I don't like about it are the way it bobs when you pedal. I don't love the looks, but like I said, that's not super important to me. I don't like the weight. It's a pound too heavy, even for being carbon maned tubes here. I think it should be a pound lighter. In talking with Motion Ride, they didn't want to put too many controls on this and confuse people, and I totally get that. It rides so different from a telescoping fork. It took me a while to get to know it, and I was a little bit confused at first, but I feel like I've really got it down now. But I don't love the damper. This is rebound and compression in one, and it's hard to turn, really hard to turn. It's really stiff, and it's got these little knobs here. And the clicks aren't very audible, but it's got a road setting, which seems weird to me, but that's super turbo firm, almost locked out. It's got a high compression firmness, a medium firmness, and then a low firmness, and then it's open, and then the damper does rebound. So from here to here, it's rebound, and then up here is pretty much lockout. So you can't control compression or rebound separately. They're tied together. You're either using this as a compression lockout or as a rebound adjustment. I like the bottom out bumpers. I've bottomed this out, but I never once felt that harsh bottom out. I feel like it ramps up quite a bit at the end. So you can't really change the feel of the stroke with volume spacers like you can with an air spring. It is what it is. And I feel like this does ramp up a little too much at the end. So some things that are super exciting, I love the carbon leaf spring. I think engineering flex into carbon is one of the best uses of carbon. I think it can do things that metal can't do quite as well at a lighter weight. I would love to see more carbon rear shocks on full suspensions. I think it's a fantastic material, and I love tightening it with the wrench instead of a pump. Another thing I don't like is that you have to completely release the tension on the spring to get the axle in and out, because this side is all spring and you set your preload in there and there's some tension on it, and you're not going to get the axle out if that's under tension. So every time you remove the axle, you have to essentially change your spring rate. Now you get used to it pretty quick and it's not hard to do, but if you're taking your wheel on and off, that's going to drive you crazy. This is probably the most over-engineered fork out there, and they've thought of a lot of cool things like the cable routing. I really like the cable routing on this thing. Yeah, it's just so unique and so different, and I'm so glad I've been able to ride it. So who's this for? This is for people who are not afraid to tinker and try different things and look different. Every time someone sees me riding this, I have to stop and explain for 5 minutes what it's all about and talk about the fork. And that's okay, I like talking with people, that's not a big deal for me. But you will get stopped. This is for people who want to be different, who don't want to be traditional. This is for people who want to experiment with what's possible on a bike and get a different ride feel than the telescoping fork. Like I said, super supple at the beginning, so comfortable there, which is a big difference from the Trust forks, the Message and the Shout. I've had the opportunity to ride both of those before the company shut down, and they ride very different from this, despite them both being linkage forks. That's kind of like saying, well, a full suspension Specialized should ride like a full suspension Orange because they both have a shock in the back. No, the linkage really changes how it feels. The Trust is the best cornering fork I've ever ridden. It just is so stiff, and when you rail a corner on that Trust, you can just lean on it like crazy, and I love the feeling of cornering on the Trust. The Trust is harsher than this in both the initial stroke, mid-stroke, and final stroke. The Trust looks cooler in my opinion. It looks beefier, and the Trust just felt less refined from a ride characteristic standpoint. The Trust was harsher. The Trust was just stiff. It just, even if you run it like 20 PSI under, it still felt stiff, and you stayed on top of everything and just kind of skipped across terrain instead of tracked it. So they kind of have a similar feel in that way, but the Motion Ride E18 Plus is way more forgiving. It's easier to ride. I feel like it's got a better ride than the Trust. I think there's a big future for linkage forks, but I don't know that they've cracked the code yet. I feel like this is close. In corners, it didn't have the support that the Trust had, and it almost felt, I almost felt some flex in there. I don't know how to describe it. It just felt like a Fox 32 in some of the corners, but then in the straight line hits, it felt like a 36. There was just something about the corners. I just had a little bit of flex in the design, and that's completely different from the Trust, which is the stiffest thing ever in corners. And man, if you haven't ridden one of those like on a slalom track, that thing is unreal. I would love to have some more control over high speed and low speed compression, high speed and low speed rebound, and something to change how much it ramps up or doesn't ramp up. I feel like they've nailed it on the first 30% of its travel, and I feel like the next 70% needs a little bit something more. I think hardtails are the perfect place to test things like wheels and bars and forks because there are so fewer variables. The rear end's the same, everything's gonna ride the same on every bike, and when I just swap out the fork, I don't have to worry about it interacting with rear suspension or anything like that. I just get to focus on the fork. This has been a super fun experiment. It's been really hard to put into words how this rides. If I had to sum it up, I would say super soft initial traction that's just amazing, and it doesn't get harsher, but it feels over damped beyond that. And even with the fast rebound, it doesn't want to track the ground so much, but you do feel the wheel kind of get out of the way when it hits things instead of move up and down. Telescoping forks, you feel the in and out, up and down movement as they go through the travel. This felt more like it was tracking the ground a little bit better. It was plenty supportive. I could still pop off of things. But yeah, I'd just like to see a little bit more tuning on the damper and some more adjustment to be able to get a different feel out of it. But I think it's been really cool. Huge shout out and props to Motion Ride for designing this thing, thinking outside the box. Starting your own fork company is not easy in this day and age. You know, they engineered it, they designed it, they built it, they marketed it, they made a website, and they're getting them out there. Huge congrats to them, and props for going up against the big guys. Telescoping suspension has been here forever, and it's what we're used to. And it's gonna take a lot for us to break out of that paradigm, but I think they're onto something, and I can't wait to see what future versions look like. If you enjoyed this video and learned something, give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks for watching. There's a party in the mountains, and you're invited.